managing to overcome the tube strike. That's extremely heroic of you. Well, we're going to be talking about slightly different heroics today, but nonetheless, you made it, so that's really good. I was beginning to feel that this talk today was a bit jinxed, because to begin with, it was going to be a talk between myself and Hawken, American author and activist, who's got a new book out about the climate crisis and CO2 and everything else. And he wrote to us about a month ago and said, I'm struck down by this dreadful disease of my blood, which means that I can't come to the UK. So we lost him. And then happily, and I am really grateful to Oliver and Cole for stepping into this particular breach and enabling us to have what I hope will be a really good conversation. Anyway, this is a genuine co-authoring initiative. If you want to do it by word count, they have 2,000 words more than me. So anybody who says, oh, it's just tokenistic, Jonathan, you just did these interviews and then you wrote the rest of it. No, it really is an attempt to provide a proper platform for people like Cole and Oliver, who, to be honest, when I saw the way in which the right-wing media in this country were talking about Just Stop Oil, and in particular about younger campaigners in Just Stop Oil, my rage reached the point where I decided I had to write another bloody book. And I know that'll sound really weird, but every time an author finishes a book, usually that author takes a huge sigh and says, never again. I mean, really and truly, I'm not going to do this again. But I was getting so incensed by the misrepresentation, and worse, the character assassination going on with people in Just Stop Oil, that I felt there has to be some mechanism for providing a platform. Platforms are difficult to create against a media backdrop where majority of people perhaps don't really want to listen to what it is that people have to say about all of that. And that is why we got to this point about how do we make narratives more powerful in a context where so many people don't want to listen. The initial title for this book was not Love, Anger, and Betrayal. It was, for God's sake, pay attention. And that was the whole idea, was to use this publishing mechanism as a way of persuading people just momentarily to stop doing whatever it is they were doing otherwise, and to focus really, really clearly on the climate crisis today. It's not just the climate crisis that gets lost in this hubbub of banality and everything else. It's many, many things. But the climate crisis is a heavy loss to humanity when we lose it in this media maelstrom. Because unless our politicians begin to focus on it, we are honestly getting very close to the point where it'll be too late to do what we need to do about it. That's the basic thrust of it, and that's the motivation for a lot of people who got involved in Just Stop Oil. As you'll probably recall, Just Stop Oil was only in our midst for 3 years. I mean, they track their story back to Insulate Britain that came just before Just Stop Oil. Insulate Britain only existed for a few months, as it happens, but they in turn emerged from Extinction Rebellion, which first burst into our lives back in 2018 or whenever it was. And that sort of continuity from Extinction Rebellion, XR, to Insulate Britain, to Just Stop Oil is really important, because it marked that moment where XR arrived in our midst. It marked a very distinct moment of discontinuity in the politics of climate change and in how the movement, the climate movement, sought to persuade government and business and citizens, civil society as a whole, and the media just to do things differently about the climate. But as I've pointed out to people regularly, I launched Friends of the Earth's first ever global warming action plan in 1985. And if I'm being strictly dispassionate about things, the intervening 40 years can't say we've really got the knack of responding proportionately to what the science is telling us. So XR's emergence in our midst, which I think was welcomed by a lot of people, actually, because it created new energy, different ways of thinking about it, and it reminded people of the critical importance of civil disobedience as a way of persuading politicians to do stuff, was a big moment. And we've tended to forget this, but XR was effective at that time. It really did get politicians to think about it differently. It persuaded the UK government to declare a parliamentary emergency, or sorry, climate emergency. It was very successful in getting people to understand that there had to be a deeper process. The House of Commons set up a citizen or climate assembly to consider all of these things. So it made an impact, there's no question about that, on the conventional political status quo. And that's what I suppose we in our minds hoped would continue to lead to increasingly responsible and proportionate action by government. So I don't think any of us today are going to be going into any great detail about the science of climate change. You'll be very, very relieved to know. But just very briefly, so that we understand the starting point for all of this, we are in really deep, deep shit. I mean, really bad. And I've only ever once reduced an audience of mine to tears, okay? I haven't learned that particular theatrical device. And that was an occasion, I was thinking about it yesterday, funnily enough. It was in New Zealand, and talking to a group of business leaders in New Zealand. And what I'd done for the 3 months before that meeting was simply to compile a climate diary of every single thing that had happened in the preceding 3 months and what it told us about the state of the climate. And I summarized that, and then I literally read them, the 32 bullet points from my climate diary, and what that would mean in terms of them, future generations, their children, all the rest of it, ratcheting up the emotional stuff as much as I could, and blow me down. 3 of them were weeping. Now, I'm not going to do that to you today, but it is a really important reminder that if you seriously get stuck into the science of climate change, you're going to find that difficult to deal with. And the reason for that is it's not like most issues where things get bad, and they get worse, and they get really bad, and then maybe we sort it out and stuff happens. And it may be a bit late in the day, but it doesn't matter. It's just that we took far too long to get it done. But eventually we get it done. A bit like women's suffrage. 40 years, well, so what? 40 years. In the end, it got done. A bit like civil rights. 50 years of campaigning. In the end, it got done, sort of. Not really in America, if you look at America now, but nonetheless it got done. So things get done. It does not work like that with climate change. If we don't do what we need to do in the period of time, the window that we still have available to us, then this accumulation of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere leads inevitably to this increased warming, which leads inevitably towards these tipping points actually bloody well tipping. And once a tipping point of that kind, these are huge tipping points, big system tipping points like the Arctic system or the Antarctic or the Amazon or the world's reefs or the permafrost and the tundra, etc. These are huge, huge systems that control much of the terrestrial and marine environment today. If they tip, they are not tipping back anytime soon. If we reach the point of no return on the Greenland ice sheet tipping, trust me, we will not see anything happen which will allow us to first stabilize and then rebuild the Greenland ice sheet in anything less than hundreds of thousands of years. So climate change is not like other existential threats to humankind. It has this irreversibility threat built into it, which is really scary. So that was what I found when I started talking to people like Cole and Oliver and started asking them what had got them into it and blow me down. That was exactly the kind of stuff that had got them into it, tracking the science, actually being respectful of the science, instead of just passing over the science as if it was a temporary inconvenience, which I think is what a lot of politicians do. Oh my God, this is tricky. Yeah, well, I'll have a look at that next week and see what that means. And on to the next thing, on to the next bit of firefighting that has to be done. And for me, it was really moving, I have to say this, genuinely moving, to discover how the science was sticking so close to the reality of people, all of whom are 50 years younger than me. Whereas for many of my peer group, the science was just going, there's such a noise out there, who knows, in here, out there, whatever it might be. And I found that extraordinary, and made it all the more extraordinary that actually the media chose to portray the actions taken by people driven by that deep sense of well-informed moral conviction, scientifically informed moral conviction, to introduce them all as eco-zealots. Well, we have 2 eco-zealots on the platform today, and a terrorist. You know, I don't know if the Conduit can ever actually lay claim to quite such an illustrious gathering. Just before I invite Cole and Oliver to say something, I just want to, if I can find it, sorry, I should have prepared earlier. I was chatting to Jeremy Vine, as they say, which was quite entertaining. But I'm just going to read you, a friend of mine has just written an amazing blog about the book, which is very generous, but also an amazing understanding of the 26 people with whom I co-authored it. And I'm just going to read you that because I'm just really keen to embarrass these 2 massively before they get stuck in. So this is what he wrote about my 26 co-authors. It's impossible to generalize about these extraordinary young people, but 4 things stand out for me. First, their selflessness. There's not an iota of self-aggrandizement on display. Secondly, their continuing surprise that not everyone sees things the way they do, when it's so obvious that not changing course will lead us to perdition. Well, he's got a bit of a literary flourish, this friend of mine. Third, the equanimity with which they accept their punishment, not because the sentences are fair, but because they believe they're doing the right thing at the right time, and in that sense they're where they have to be. And fourth and lastly, the road traveled by each of them. Each and every one of these protesters has started near the bottom of the commitment escalator and ridden that escalator to the top. Now, I've never used that metaphor, by the way, but I really like it. That's why I'm sharing it with you today. From there, the top of the escalator, they survey an uncertain future, both theirs and the planet's, making sacrifices along the way, though they may not see them that way themselves, that few of the rest of us would be willing to make. At some point in that uncertain future, these young activists, vilified from all sides, including by those on the same side, by which he means the mainstream environment movement, we may want to come back to that, will be recognized for the courageous, right-minded people they are. So, nice bit of writing, nice segue now to Cole and Oliver. Now, who's going to go first? Were you going to go first?
I can go first.
You can go first, okay. So I'm going to ask, obviously, I'm going to ask both of them to, you've got your own, to say a little bit about why they're in the book, because obviously it was a bit random, finding 26 in the end. They all had to be below a certain age range. And I was very dependent on Just Stop Oil actually identifying people who wanted to contribute and get involved in the process. But I need both Oliver and Cole to explain a bit about them in the book. You will then, subsequently, once you've bought a copy of the book, which you're all going to do, you'll be able to read in more detail the offences they committed and why. Oliver.
Hello. God, this will probably be really underwhelming after that review and Jonathan's speech, but yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Oliver. I'm 22. I've just recently graduated from Manchester, so I came from Manchester for this event, and that was doing plant science, but please don't ask any gardening questions. I'm embarrassingly terrible at keeping plants alive. But I was briefly and not particularly successfully involved in XR just before COVID and then right afterwards, and then it was through that sort of like newly formed student XR group there was a sort of dissatisfaction, some people going off into Insulate Britain, and they were saying there's going to be this cool new thing starting. It's going to be Just Stop Oil. That's the thing that's going to be happening. And so that's how I then became involved in JSO. and yeah, I initially was like recruiting people into it. We were trying to like build our numbers, but I was really terrible at that. I think I recruited one person and he dropped out of the protest he was supposed to be doing the day before. So instead of leafleting, giving talks, we decided that we needed some more unmissable ways of getting attention. And so that's when we switched to pitch invasion. So I did Tottenham versus West Ham a few years back, and I've just come off my football banning order, so I'm actually now legally allowed to watch football if I wanted to, which I'm not sure I actually do want to, but I could. And then I was a spokesperson for the campaign for quite a while, and yeah, I was briefly, as well as football, I was briefly banned from GB News for swearing, and I blocked a fair few oil terminals, and then I moved into focusing more specifically on trying to organise the sort of queer activists within JSO. So we did a all-queer roadblock in Trafalgar Square, and then about a year later blocked the Coca-Cola float at Pride in protest, Pride having gone from what was an act of civil disobedience into now being this sort of like corporatized pantomime. And then about a year following that, this is my most recent protest activity, then with Youth Demand, which is a sort of affiliate of Just Stop Oil, and sort of composed of students with a focus on climate but also on Palestine. Then with Youth Demand, in celebration of the end of the Tories, I pretended to take a shit in Rishi Sunak's lake just before the general election. Yeah, so I think that is the potted history of me.
Anything else you'd like to say? I mean, let's ask Cole to introduce herself and then come back, and I'm going to ask you then both a couple of questions to follow up on that. But Cole, your sort of story is slightly different from that.
Yeah, so, while Oliver was in Rishi Sunak's lake, I was in prison. So watching that on the news was quite fun. But yeah, so I got started with Just Stop Oil quite late. I've only been arrested with Just Stop Oil once, but it was a pretty major arrest, I think. When I was a teenager, I essentially became homeless in some form. I was living very precariously with a group of my friends in a house, and I was taking lots of substances and was very sick. And during this time, XR popped up, and I was looking at them on Instagram and on telly, and just kind of, they were just everywhere, like couldn't avoid them. And I was looking at it, and I was like, wow, I wish I could do that. I wish there was some way I could do that. But because of my life position, I couldn't go to London. There wasn't a local group. I couldn't like risk what like little I had, or I didn't think I could. Now I'm like, you could have done something. But it was, it really connected with me. And then as I grew up, away from being 15 and 16, I ended up going to college. I'd been expelled from my first sixth form college, and that's why I was in such a precarious position. And I ended up going to my second college, and I sort of settled my life down a bit more. I ended up going to university, and it was when I went to university that I really connected with civil disobedience and activism and politics and protest in a way that I'd wanted to before. So at my university, I went to the University of Brighton, and there were lots of student protests when I was there because the university was trying to fire or make redundant 110 academic staff. And obviously as students at the university, we were shocked and appalled by that. Like, how are you going to fire half of our lecturers? Why are we paying $9,000 a year for this? And so we were pretty pissed off. And that was the first time I ever organized any protest, was ever involved in any demonstrations, and it was one of the most empowering experiences of my life to finally, after living quite a dangerous and abusive life up until that point, to realize, oh, I have the power to make change that I want to see. And it started in my university, and it carried on to the local arms factory in Brighton. There's an arms factory called L3 Harris, and they make the bomb release mechanisms for F-35 fighter jets that are then sold to Israel to use against Palestinian people in their genocide. And I wasn't very involved in Just Stop Oil up until last year because I didn't like them. And I mean, it was funny when you were mentioning like the media, because I definitely fell for that. I was like, why are people throwing soup? Why are they on football pitches? Like, why are they? I don't understand any of this. Why are they doing these things? And then I went to a demonstration called Oily Money Out after my experience with the student protests, and I was like, oh my God, half these people from Just Stop Oil, and they're really, really nice. They're really nice and they're really friendly, and I was just like, I have been completely lied to. And I was studying politics, so I'm like, I don't know how you didn't realize you were being lied to up until now. And then I was like, oh, maybe I'm slightly interested. And then I went to my local, at that time, Just Stop Oil students meeting, which has now become Youth Demand, I think, yes. And I basically just got involved from there. And then in the summer of last year, I was arrested for allegedly breaking into an airport and damaging 2 private jets. I was held in the police station for 3 days. Oh no. 3 of the hottest days of the year, and my cell was so cold that I was wearing thermal clothes, 2 layers of police greys, blankets, and I couldn't sleep because I was so cold. And it was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. I went to prison, I was released. I had some of the strictest bail conditions any activist has ever had, according to NetPol. And yeah, since I was released from prison, I have been wrongfully arrested 5 times, 4 of which was for going to hospital once. So I've had a pretty crazy year. But yeah, I guess that's me up until right now.
And Monday?
Oh, yeah, my trial is on Monday. My trial is in a week.
So a week today, Cole's trial starts. Okay, so before we come to a bit of general discussion, do either of you, now looking back on it and thinking about the impact that Just Stop Oil had on politics in general, so not just the climate issue, but concerns about the right to protest and issues of that kind. Do either of you have any regrets at having put yourself in jeopardy in that way?
Oh gosh, a tough question. I mean, essentially no. I mean, especially with regards to the changing landscape around protest laws, then occasionally JSO gets the blame sort of shunted onto it, as though JSO in some way forced the government or Palestine Action forced the government into becoming more repressive to protest. And it's like, no, if the government wants to withhold the right to protest, it is going to do it, whether you seem lovely and respectable or whether you seem shocking and provocative. So I don't feel like JSO deserves the blame for that. And of course, aspects of the tactics can be kind of nitpicked over, but by and large, it just remains the case. The civil resistance is effective. That contrary to what's sometimes kind of thought and said, it being more shocking, it being more provocative, is, if anything, more powerful, more potent, and certainly gets more media attention and more likely to be discussed by politicians. Yeah.
For me, I've been asked a lot if I'm ashamed or embarrassed or regret it for various reasons. And my response is always that shame is not mine to hold. When I tell people, especially people around me, when they ask me, well, all of these arrests and all of the mistreatment in these like wrongful arrests that you've had and your time in prison and your mistreatment in prison, like, do you not just regret what you did? Allegedly. My trial is next week. Do you not regret these things? And I say, it's not, I could never do what the police and the government and the legal systems and the prisons have done to me, even if I got paid. And so for me, that shame and that guilt and that regret should not be mine. I would never deny someone healthcare and get paid for it. I would never take someone away from their family and get paid for it. And so it's not my shame or my guilt or my regret to hold, it's theirs. And that's always my response.
It was particularly interesting because you may recall in the summer of last year that the main JSO campaign was about mainstream airports and actually carrying out actions at Manchester and Heathrow and other airports around the country, essentially trying to remind people about to fly off on their holidays that this wasn't necessarily the best thing for them to be doing. And I think it is universally agreed now in the JSO family, Just Stop Oil family, that was not a particularly smart strategic decision because it was extremely difficult to land the message. But one action going after private jets, and by and large we all do have, I suspect, quite deep dislike of anybody who can own or even fly in a private jet, made the point rather differently that the climate crisis is also a justice crisis. It's not just an environment story or a climate story, it is about justice. And I think in a way, whatever happens next, and nobody quite knows what's going to happen next regarding Just Stop Oil, that element of justice needs to be built into it. And I know this is something that Oliver talks about quite a lot as well. So just before we come to general discussions, obviously you're in a very different position, Cole, because your trial has yet to start. Oliver, you're out of the legal process now. You can even go to football matches, blow me down. Doesn't make you an upstanding citizen, don't forget, because other things might be held against you in future. But how do you feel now about the way the climate crisis is sort of still not being addressed in a way that would give it the significance that it so obviously needs politically?
I mean, at an obvious level, it's depressing that action is inadequate. I mean, JSO never set about to entirely solve the problem, and perhaps this is one of the issues with the airports, is it broadened the focus. But prior to that, the focus had very much been on there being an end to fossil fuel licensing. That was a difficult demand to win, but it was considered to be achievable. And with hindsight, we can say it definitely was achievable because it has now happened. And there haven't been any new fossil fuel licenses since the Tories left power. And so it was never the expectation that Just Stop Oil would singularly solve the climate crisis. It was that it would put enough pressure that it can solve this one particular issue, fossil fuel licensing, which is in and of itself significant, but perhaps more important than that is by sort of building a kind of protest movement, by demonstrating that the protest can work, then the hope would be, whether this happens, whether this is just naive hope, I don't know, but the hope would be that that leads to even more protest, that inspires further action.
It is obviously very frustrating and depressing. Just gonna mirror what Ollie said. It's just infuriating to know that nothing is still being done. But I also think that what Just Stop Oil did, and also even, I think, ending Just Stop Oil and the obvious reasons why we ended, I think that has actually done some good as well. I think that people now more than ever are realizing and understanding that these shared fights for Palestine or anti-imperialism or anti-apartheid, anti-capitalist, and the climate are all shared. And so I think before, when Just Stop Oil started, I feel like it was quite an individual group that had one goal. And now, because of the injustice that everyone is facing, because of the government's legislation and tactics and the insane levels of policing and violence that the government are using against, well, it kind of feels like anyone that shows any disagreement to them, I think that's actually brought all of these people from different fights together. And while I do feel as though the government isn't really doing anything on the climate, I do think that the people, us, are standing together more than we have done in, well, at least my lifetime, but that's not very long. So, yeah, in a while.
There is a bit of a test coming, of course, because there's huge pressure on the government to reissue the license to develop the Rosebank oil and gas field, which is the biggest remaining asset, as the oil and gas companies call it, near Shetland. And that is a huge thing. And if the Labour government approves that now, it's going to be really interesting to see what everyone will do about that, because basically that does, in effect, mean going back on the no new licenses. They have a technical legal get-out. It's not a new license. It is an old license refreshed with new information about the massive carbon footprint which will come from burning all the oil and gas that the field produces. But that is going to be a moment for the climate movement here in the UK, that's for sure. Okay, so let's sort of go where we will with some questions, for all three of us, for one of us, doesn't really matter. I was always told, Charles, never to take the first hand that goes up, because it is guaranteed to be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. In your case, of course, I know that is not the case, but still. No, I'm going to take the gentleman in the back whose hand shot up just marginally before yours.
I'll let you go first. No. But now I've got so many questions to ask. But first of all, I just want to say, maybe it's just me, but I have massive respect for what you two have done at such an early age. And I just think we deserve a round of applause. Just massive respect. So well done. Coal, and I can't help thinking about Just Stop Coal. It wasn't. Lucky it wasn't that, isn't it? But were you one of the people who threw the paint at the aircraft in wherever it was, the RAF place?
No.
You weren't?
Mine was exactly to the point, exactly a year before,
okay.
with Just Stop Oil, and the paint was a slightly different colour.
Because I just wanted to say, for some reason, they kind of lost the initiative on that, because it was announced that it caused £9 million worth, or £9 billion worth of damage. And did it really? I mean, I don't think it really did. Anyway, sorry, but a more general question is, are you excited, any of the three of you, by the change in the leadership of the Green Party? Is that going to be a bit of a change?
That's a bit left field. I don't know. You got any interest in the Green Party at all? I'm a member of the Green Party. Well, yeah, my membership was actually suspended 20 years ago, and they never lifted my suspension. So I am a member of the Green Party, but sort of theoretically suspended. I'm excited by Zach's election as the Green Party leader. He's going to stir things up, and he will definitely have an eye on the new politics emerging with your party, with Jeremy Corbyn and Farhana Sultana, which is fascinating. And there's a new movement just launched today, bringing the centre-left together. So I mean, there's a definite buzz about all this stuff. My one thing I would say that I'm worried about is that his style of leadership for Zach is polarizing. He likes to put things in black and white terms. If you're this, you can't be that. And in some of the issues for the Green Party, that very, very sharp polarizing story is difficult to deal with. As a party leader, you probably need to be a bit more of a healer and a reconciler than a polarizer. But I'm going to exempt you two from answering that because it may not be of any interest. Let's go to Charles and see what happens. Sorry.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Charles Perry. Cole, I was reading about the poem. And by the way, I mean, amazing courage. I really thank you for your courage. I think your poem that you said helped you get through 3 days in solitary confinement, right? So could you just tell us about that poem? But also, before you tell us about the poem, can you just set the context a bit more about you're arrested, you have 3 days in solitary confinement, then you're bailed, then you have an ankle tag, and yeah, just talk us through that bit before the poem and the actual moments in solitary confinement, please.
So I was arrested, I was taken to the police station. You're only really meant to be held for 24 hours, unless you're arrested under the Terrorism Act, in which case they can hold you for up to 7 days, keep you incommunicado for 24 hours. They can deny you loads of your regular rights, just because they decide to brand you as a terrorist. Sorry. So for a regular arrest, you're meant to be there for 24 hours. Just before the 24 hours hit, they extended it for 12 hours. And then just before the end of the 12 hours, they said, actually, we're going to hold you till court. So then I was held another maybe around 24 hours, maybe slightly less. I was taken to court. The court is across the road from the police station that I was in, and then they couldn't get us there, so for some reason. So we stayed in the police station, we being me and the other person I was arrested with. And we got put in a little room with a webcam and a screen, with a police officer sat next to us, and that was our bail hearing. They denied us bail. We then got sent back to the police station, sent back to our cells in the police station, and waited for the prison van to come and pick us up. They picked us up, and then we got driven to prison. And then I went to prison, and then I got released on bail because I don't have a criminal record. This is my first and only trial, and so luckily I got bail, but lots of other people have been denied bail for various ridiculous reasons. And then after I got bailed, I was on ankle tag. I was on ankle tag for, I actually lost count. It might be 9 months, it might be 10, I'm not sure. And the ankle tag was a 12-hour curfew from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And then when I was released from prison, I had to sign in every day at the police station. So I had to go to the police station every day. I had my ankle tag on. I couldn't work. I couldn't see my family. I couldn't see my friends. I couldn't see anyone. Really, I was like, I would rather be in prison where they refused to give us food that we could eat and where we were allowed outside of our cells for 20 minutes a day. I was like, I'd rather be there because this is worse. And then my ankle tag came off, and now I can do things like this. But yeah, so the poem, when I was in the cell, I mentioned in my little introduction that it was freezing cold. It was. I cannot stress how mentally challenging being freezing cold and not seeing the sun for 3 days was. It was probably one of the most difficult experiences of my entire life. And I was actually wearing these shoes, and one of the things that you do when you're arrested is you have to take off your shoes and leave them in a little cubby or leave them by your door so that you can't have your shoes because they're heavy and you can throw them, and so you can't have your shoelaces. And because I was in there for so long and I was going in and out of the cell for interviews or to shower, one time the police officer accidentally let me keep my shoes, and it was so awful in there. I hadn't seen the sun. I asked a police officer who was walking past, because they do checks, what the weather was like, and she told me it was really hot and sunny, and I didn't believe her, because I'd been freezing cold for so long that I didn't believe that it was hot outside. And so I was sat on my little sheet of plastic that they give you as a mattress, and I was looking at my shoes that they'd let me keep by accident, and I was like, I can't stay in this cell. I was like, I can't stay here. And I saw the shoelaces, and it took all of my mental energy to not just end it all in that cell, because I hadn't seen the sun. No one knew where I was. It was freezing cold. You have to ask the police officers for water. You don't get a tap or a cup in Chelmsford police station. In some police stations, you get a sink in your room. So I couldn't wash my hands after I'd gone to the toilet. I couldn't get water. You literally have to press the emergency buzzer and ask for water. And the amount of times I'd ask for water and they just wouldn't bring it, or ask for food or ask for medication and they just wouldn't come and bring it. It was just atrocious. And so I was like ready to just not carry on. And so that poem, I was walking around the cell, dragging my fingers along the grouting because it was tiled. And they tile it so that if anything happens, it's easy to clean, which is sickening. And I was dragging my finger along the tile of the grouting, just waiting and waiting and waiting in the dark and the cold. And it just came to me, like, I am strong, I am brave, I do care, I am here for a reason. These spaces are built to make us lose hope and be passionless, but by being hopeful and being passionate, I am resisting. And in that moment that it just came, I was like, okay, I've lost everything. I know I'm going to go to prison. I'm freezing cold. I've had nothing to eat. I haven't had any painkillers. Everything was gone. And I was just like, I can't even take, responsibility for the poem because it just came to me. And I stuck it up on my wall in prison when I first got there. And it was the last thing I took down and the first thing I put up when I moved cells. And then when I got home, I stuck that same piece of paper up on my wall. So that's the poem.
Great, thank you. Yes, anyone else got anything to raise? Any questions? Other than how do we get rid of this bloody noise? Which I guess we don't.
Thank you so much. And this question feels very flat after that. That was really emotional. Thank you so much for sharing that. You were talking about how when Extinction Rebellion kind of came out, the message kind of landed with government. And I certainly felt that when I work in the renewable energy industry, and I felt like that did kind of land. I do a lot of public engagement, and I feel like the vibe was quite positive. I remember walking over Waterloo Bridge when it was shut, and it was a really nice atmosphere. And then with Just Stop Oil, I think, I'm kind of glad that they did call it a day with Just Stop Oil, because it was definitely, losing the public. And I saw that absolutely in the sort of public engagement that we do, that people sort of, the general public were turning off. And I guess my question is, how do we get the message across now? And what your thoughts are?
I have a thought, which is just that JSO wasn't aimed at the public, and neither really was XR, but JSO was not trying to it was not trying to win over members of the public. It was not trying to win a popularity contest. It didn't want people to take a particular action. It wasn't about that sort of you should be using paper straws, kind of thing. If that was the aim of JSO, it would be the most unbelievable failure ever, and its tactics would be really stupid. But the entire endeavour was aimed squarely at government and to an extent to business, and the theory was that causing enough disruption repeatedly, initially to oil terminals, then later to roads in London, that causing enough of that disruption puts government and business into a situation where they feel the need to concede so that the disruption stops. Not the need to concede because they think you're amazing and they love you, but the need to concede just so that the whole headache of having people protesting constantly is over and done with. And as things worked out, the Tories never changed their policy, whatever sort of won over by or conceded to JSO. But given the fossil fuel licensing really was not that prominent of an issue even within the climate movement, it really feels like something was talked about in geography conferences or something, but it was not a hot button political issue. It was certainly prior to JSO, the issuing of a license for a fossil fuel project would never have got front page news. After JSO, it has a political dimension, so when licenses happen, it becomes news. So basically, the issue was elevated, and it then became a situation where Labour could be thinking, oh, there's a constituency of like anti-fossil fuel licence voters. We should co-opt them in by adopting the same demand, and it's a sort of I guess what's sometimes referred to as like the radical flank effect, where JSO, by being so overtly radical, it doesn't exactly win friends, but it makes people say, oh, I'm not as bad as those people, but I do agree that something needs to be done about climate. And that's not very kind of edifying for you as a person. Maybe you'd rather have people going like, whoa, you're great. But from a tactical perspective, it works equally well for people to support the goal without supporting the campaign personally.
I don't really think I can add to that. That was so perfectly said.
Yeah, it is one of these things, and there's a lot in this about the book that Oliver mentioned, the radical flank, and then you've got the moderate flank, and we've got the new climate majority program and lots of things going on today. Look, the really brutal truth about all of this, and it is horrible to have to face up to this, is that no set of tactics has worked. So historically, although we've seen huge increases in awareness and science and some political response, but the measure of success is whether the gap between what the science tells us and what the political response to that science, has that gap narrowed? And of course not. The gap continues to get wider today. So literally nothing has worked. And that is why there has to be space for some kind of civil disobedience. There are a lot of analogies with the suffragettes, obviously, and with the civil rights movement. Both Emmeline Pankhurst and Martin Luther King were excoriating in their contempt for the mainstream elements in their respective movements, both the suffrage movement and the civil rights movement. Emmeline Pankhurst in particular had a real go at anybody who was still into suffragist territory, trying to do things by talking to knobheads in government and trying to overcome the male establishment that had kept suffrage off any successful path to legislation for 45 years. And Martin Luther King, although obviously was a bit more polite than Emmeline Pankhurst, was equally damning, particularly of nice white liberals who said how much they cared about ensuring that there was full civil rights for all citizens, but particularly for black Americans at that time. So it's a long historical debate that is really important. I know we have to sort of finish in a moment because the live stream ceases to be live, I think, at a certain point. Is there one last point with one quick question which will warrant instantaneous answers, which will then allow us to kind of bring it to a conclusion? Thank you.
Hi. So very moving, everything that we've heard. What next, I think, is my question. So you've been doing this a very long time, Jonathan, and obviously Cole and Oliver, you've made some real kind of incredible sacrifices in the things that you've done. When you look to the next sort of 5 to 10 years, where is the hope, or where is what direction do we go from here?
For me, I think aside from the climate, the main issue that all protests or direct action groups are facing is these authoritarian and don't know how, I'm going to say fascist, policing laws and laws around the justice system. I think that needs to be, if not the main focus, but a core focus in every single group that ever happens ever in the future. Especially, maybe you could talk about your experience on Saturday.
Probably not, but Oliver, quickly.
Oh, I don't have much to add. I was hoping you'd ask like a yes/no question. You'd just be like, "What's your favourite colour?" or something. It's such a huge question, and honestly, I don't know what comes next. But I very much agree with Carl. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's so important to put the emphasis on the human rights side of it, because obviously the climate crisis is all-encompassing, but we know it's going to get tougher. And to deal with it as it gets tougher, the resilience and the health of our democracy is fundamental. And the only way to protect that is by protecting people's human rights. And for me, sort of in a most peculiar way, I was involved in the debate in the year 2000 when the Terrorism Act was being drafted. And at the time, I just mentioned this to Cole and Oliver earlier, at the time, politicians kept saying, no, don't worry, this phrase here about causing serious damage, that will never be used in such a way that it will actually constrain the activities of any responsible protest group. Because, clearly we wouldn't extend the powers that far. They kept mentioning Greenpeace in particular. We'd never use that against Greenpeace to prove that they were a terrorist organization. Now, 25 years on, here we are. And okay, it is a bit different. Palestine Action is maybe a notch up from Greenpeace. But I now am very focused on the human rights side of it. And for me, the climate crisis and the human rights side of it have sort of merged. Not quite in the way I was anticipating, but they have definitely merged, which has sort of enabled me to rediscover some of my own radical roots. And that's partly due to the 26 people with whom I shared this amazing experience. Right, we have to bring this to an end. So this is the point where things get really grubby and commercial, okay, which is where I say there are 20 books sitting at the back of the room. I have brought them in my bicycle pannier from Cheltenham this morning. I do not want to have to take them back to Cheltenham later on. The reason why I hope you will all buy one is even if you don't want to read it yourself, you know someone who needs to read it. Okay? That is really important. The book is written for people who need persuading that this is a genuine crisis and we've got tons of stuff to do and brilliant inspirational examples of people who are doing it. The second thing is that all the proceeds from the sales of the book are going to support climate activism. So literally every copy we sell here goes straight to the successor organization for Just Stop Oil, for Youth Demand that is still very active, for the brilliant Defend Our Juries, which has been doing all this stuff about human rights. So I hope that you'll feel inclined to spare me lugging them back to Cheltenham. But thank you very much, and particular thanks, obviously, to Cole and to Oliver for joining us today. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you with us. Thank you very much.